Our next speaker is an internationally renowned and extremely accomplished socially engaged artist, Vic McEwan from the Cadfactory. He's presenting an artwork here today, as well as reflecting on his experiences in bringing art into the clinic. Thank you so much, Vic.
Thanks very much, Claire. I believe I'm online now and everybody can hear me. I'm currently zooming in from Wiradjuri country in the Western Riverina of New South Wales, where I run an organisation called the Cadfactory with my partner, Sarah McEwan. And our organisation is understands inherently the ideas of the social determinants of health, and therefore we've built a 15 to 20 year practice that's been built on working out within communities, often working around very complex issues within communities, using experimental contemporary arts practice. So importantly to our practice is the idea of retaining some of those essences of an experimental and contemporary arts practice, but understanding that that sort of practice is positioned in the world and is in response to the world. However, over the last number of years, I've been working more and more in clinical spaces, including in children's hospitals and hospitals with adults. And currently I'm undergoing a form of research as part of a practice-led PhD working at the Sydney Facial Nerve Clinic. And so the work there is in partnership with a multidisciplinary team of doctors who work with patients that are suffering from facial paralysis as a result of various things such as cancers, Bell's palsy, tumours, trauma, etc. So it's a very sort of complex position to place yourself in as an artist. It really speaks to the kind of forward-thinking nature of that clinic that is a multidisciplinary team, that they even had the foresight to invite an artist into that space. And so it's a kind of unusual position to place yourself as a contemporary and experimental artist within those places. And I make that determination because what I'm speaking to when I talk about my position being as a contemporary experimental artist means I'm not there to deliver an already devised arts and health program. So what I'm doing is positioning my arts practice, my studio as it were, into the clinical space. And so that sounds very sort of exciting in a romanticized notion, but that also brings with it a sort of responsibility for me as an artist, but also for the clinicians and the clinic around me to understand that a studio space for an artist is full of experiments, it's full of the unknown, it's full of fear, it's full of failures, and that there must be a place also within the successes that we bring for us to have a position where we can explore some of those things if we're positioning our studio within the clinical space. And so my time over the last year of working in the Sydney Facial Nerve Clinic has had a number of amazing outcomes where I get to sit in the clinic space, I get to engage with sessions with doctors and patients, and then work with patients and doctors one-on-one. And there's a number of artistic outcomes that are already developing from the creation of that work. And I'm going to show you today just it's a 10-minute video that's really showing a perspective of a patient at the Sydney Facial Nerve Clinic that I've worked with, and also a doctor. In fact, one of the doctors who founded the Sydney Facial Nerve Clinic, until his recent retirement, was considered a world leader in the facial nerve. However, despite his great knowledge, hadn't had any experience of an artist sitting within that space. And so a great sort of opportunity for him to reflect on what that might mean and his own sort of history of working in such a complex space. And so I might ask Thomas to play that video for me now, and then I'll come back and just sort of wrap up and make some more comments about it. So thanks, Thomas.
It feels like someone takes your world and throws it against the wall and jumps all over it and throws it in the trash and drags part of it out and the result of that was that my life was completely turned upside down, inside out, and no longer resembled something that I could recognize. I've always longed for people to get to know me beyond what they can see. I think that's something that I've really always wanted from people. One half of my face works, and they see the other half doesn't work, but all they focus on is this half that doesn't work. But then if they spend the time to get to know me and turn that image around, you can see behind that image there's a huge black void, and you don't know what's in that void. And I feel that when people spend a little bit of time around me, they get to experience that, and they get to experience what I'm actually like as a person. I'm just getting on with living my life how I want to live it, irrespective of the perceptions that other people will have. Part of doing that has been me coming to terms with accepting that people have their opinions and they can project those opinions onto me. But at the end of the day, I just have to push them aside and keep going with what I'm doing. To be quite frank, I feel quite distant from my appearance. Like my being is very separate from my physical appearance. And I think that's because I don't really associate me with having a physical appearance, so much of a physical appearance anymore. I recognize that's me. But to me, a person isn't their physical appearance. I think in a sense, having avoided the mirror for so long kind of exaggerated the problem when I did look at the mirror again. So sometimes I'm ignored. I've been spoken down to, been spoken to very slowly and very loudly. Some people will look at me once and then never look at me again, and even while they're talking to me, they won't look at me. They avoid eye contact. I've noticed that a few people, their pupils dilate a little as well. They look at the ground, a reasonable amount, as part of avoiding eye contact. I guess there was a feeling of inadequacy, so I always felt quite inadequate as a person. I just think that's very human, just very unashamedly human. Where I used to see something wrong with that, I don't think there's anything wrong with that anymore. Emotions don't have to be a physical manifestation as much as they're a metaphysical manifestation. And I can be happy without outwardly projecting that. And I don't need a physical vessel to be happy. And I'm quite content with with my face at the moment, and I'm becoming more accepting of it. And it's because I feel intrinsically very, very happy with who I am as a person.
One of the largest barriers to care is effective communication. Care can be anything from reassuring a patient right through to managing a patient who you have diagnosed and revealing to them your knowledge and insight into what that tumour represents for them and their family and their life, educating them up to a point where they can make informed decisions, and then implementing skills which you have honed and learned over years to be able to make a significant change to their life. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was hand your problem over to me. I know best. I'll take care of it and I'll give you back what's left of your life. You know, the ability to be able to communicate with empathy and insightfulness are things that I think are important. I have honed specific surgical talents which lead to me objectifying patients with physical disorders to the detriment, I'm sure, of being able to fully assess and deal with the patient's emotional response to their disorder. I think the objective part of what I do has a practical use to the patient, but subjectively, I feel that with facial nerve disorders, I skate along and try and minimize that as a way of basically being able to cope. It's a mechanism which allows me to stick with some degree of certainty to those things I can do without actually having to take on the full emotional impact of a facial nerve disorder, which is extraordinarily devastating. If you give the patient information and power to make decisions, to a degree, subjectivity and objectivity becomes a thing of the past, and it becomes an agreement between the patient and the doctor as to what is important to them and what is most important as far as care goes.
Thanks very much, Thomas. When I create works like this with patients in the facial nerve clinic, I'm seeing, you know, the outcome as both art making and also a form of research that I'm sharing with people. And so the benefits that I'm experiencing or identifying in this type of work, you know, happen during the process of being there as a person within the clinical space. It happens as an audience member when I present works in public. So the video that you're seeing playing just now is some of the outcomes recently presented at the Tate in Liverpool. And it just shows some of the responses of people who are exposed to some of the making of this work. That included that video that you saw of William, one of the patients at the facial nerve clinic, a work that shared the story of Glen. Another work which I call a biomedical composing machine, which takes readings from people's heart rates, their blood oxygen levels, and their temperature, and it uses that information to create music. So it takes that data live and it creates a live composition that's created directly from the data that's being extracted from a person's body in the gallery, but also potentially in the clinical space. So as a clinician takes these vital signs of a patient, there's a giving back to the patient through the composition of music that happens live through this biomedical composing machine. And so these works were installed in the Tate for 2 weeks as a form of research, so not as a final exhibition, but as an opportunity for me to understand how people engage with the artworks, and to have conversations with people and to conduct interviews with them afterwards as a form of data collection. Understanding that, you know, it's a complex question, it's a complex thing to take something such as facial nerve paralysis into a contemporary art gallery as a form of sort of art making that people might want to engage with in the first place. And so the work both presented stories to people, but it also invited people into the presentation of the artwork. And I see that there is no separation between the work I'm doing in the clinic and then the next stage of presenting some of this work to the public. I created this facial nerve harp, which has strings that are roughly in the position of the 5 branches of your facial nerve as it crosses the face, which lay dormant in somebody who doesn't have operation of those facial nerves. And so this is a method of giving voice to those nerves. It's something that the patient can come and engage with. They can learn about the facial nerve and its 5 branches, whilst they can play this instrument and engage and be immersed in the sound that they create in interaction with the facial nerve. And so again, it was an opportunity for people in the audience in the gallery space to come and be involved in the work and to be part of the making of the work. Participants also had the opportunity to be 3D scanned in 2 forms. One was to create a type of wire mesh image that shows the geometry of your face. And the other one was to be 3D printed and added to a wall that we built up over time every day, creating slithers, partial faces of people, and creating this wall that brought all different types of people together. The diversity of people in this wall is quite astonishing, from recently relocated refugees to tourists to students, young kids, elderly people, who are able to engage with the work and become part of it and see their face implicated in the work in consideration of others around them. And I think that some of the richness that I'm discovering in the making of this work is that we have this sort of outcome base within a gallery space where people are able to engage with the final product of art. But there's many other stages of those sort of outcome processes. So the videos that I showed at the start of this presentation, you know, what I'm discovering have a real role when they're played to other doctors, for example. There isn't much of an opportunity for doctors to stop and talk about how they respond or don't respond to the ethical, to the emotional aspect of their practice and of medicine, and what it means to be exposed to the very emotive experiences that their patients are having, and how they manage the very practical knowledge and skill that they have, and how they can sustain life in some cases, and how they balance that. And so I think there's a whole avenue of impact that can be had there in the sharing of this artistic work as final artistic work back to the clinical space. So the process happens in space and the making happens in the clinical space, but then the sharing is exposed back within that clinical space. And so I found also that the sharing of stories of William, for example, in a gallery context, enabled people to reflect on, you know, firstly, how they might treat people that they encounter who have difference. And so it made people responded by saying, you know, the exposure to this type of work equips them in some way to deal with what shock they might feel, or whatever the emotional thing that they feel is that causes them to place others in a position of othering, where they acknowledge difference in a way that's negative. So we're exposing all of this as a type of normalization of that the world is made up of people that are in different situations and have different physical appearances, different cultural backgrounds, etc. So a lot of this work, placing this work in the clinical space, engaging with the sometimes acceptance of this work in the clinical space, and sometimes the difficult negotiations that you have to go through to acknowledge that your position there is relevant and of value. You know, the continuation of sticking to that sort of work is about trying to normalize the presence of somebody like me, a contemporary experimental artist who's placing their process of inquiry, their responsive and reflective artistic practice within a space that responds immediately and over time to what's encountered in the clinical space. And I think, therefore, it's a way to position another type of thinking within the clinical space. And through exposure and through seeing some of the outcomes and the successes of these outcomes, it helps towards that sort of normalization of artistic practice within a clinical space, a space that's been traditionally closed off to anybody without that deep medical knowledge. And so it's a real, you know, honor and privilege to be in those spaces and to negotiate them. And it's also a complex negotiation. And then when these successes do come from some of this making and some of these outcomes, one of the fears or one of the risks I think that can start to happen is when we start to talk about using the arts as a tool. So people start talking about wanting to replicate specific successes, or start wanting to use it as something that's predefined as a tool. And there's a sort of, you know, there's something that's fine, but also something that's risky in that sort of language, because when we start defining something so clearly as a tool, we start defining actually what it is, and we build frameworks around it that start to limit the actual potential that it is that we want to celebrate in the first place. What it is that an artist might bring to that space in terms of looking holistically at the space, looking holistically at the experience of the patient, and just as importantly, the experience of the clinician and the staff that are working within these spaces. And so I think, whilst I celebrate the value that artistic practice can have and the very practical value, I also am careful around using words such as tool. And I think at the moment, you know, today, in my present understanding of this type of practice, which can be different tomorrow or in a week's time, I see my practice, rather than being a tool, I see it as being in service of. So I see it as acknowledging the types of things that Katrina talks about that are inherent in Indigenous cultures and those types of understandings. Things that we might find in Western philosophers such as Karen Barad, for example, who talks about ethico-ontoepistemologies, meaning the ethics of how we place ourselves in the world, the ethics of how we form new knowledge, and the ethics of how we share that knowledge and understand it and position ourselves around that sort of knowledge. And I think within my practice, I also acknowledge the you know, philosophical work of Levitas, who came before Karen Barad, who talked about that if we are in this world, then we stand face to face with the other. And when we stand face to face with the other, we become ethically obliged to respond to the other. And so it's this notion of ethics rather than an idea of creating a practical tool that I think is for my artistic practice and the way that I'm trying to approach this work, delivers some of the deeper benefits that are being created. And so through this work, I'm actively trying to implicate the participant in the work. I'm actively trying to implicate the clinical process. I'm actively trying to implicate the audience in the presentation of this work by having them engage and become involved and reflect on themselves through the making of this work. And I'm also implicating myself. And by myself, I mean myself in terms of an artist, but also myself in terms of a human being, working in an engaged manner with other human beings in a very human environment, such as a clinical space. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vic. And your words certainly resonate with me, as I have long considered that the ethical qualities that are inherent to the ways in which creative arts pulls us into engagement with each other are profoundly underlay some of the transformative potential that we see in arts and health.